Yo, this is the fourth video in this series, and we'll be looking at how to retrieve data. And beyond retrieving data, we'll also be looking at how we could set up function that would help us to execute other codes, because these codes are interrelated to each other. There's a whole lot we are going to be learning, so let's jump right in. So how do we retrieve data? We are able to retrieve data from a particular file if we are able to read that file. So in other words, what we want to do in this video is to read files. So how do we read files? Remember that we do not have the db.json file, right? So we'll still try to read the file just to show you how it behaves, what happens when we do that. So I will first import fs from fs, and then fs provides us with a method known as read file. In the read file takes in the file name and then a callback function that either throws an error or returns the data that exists inside that file. So the file we want to look at is db.json, and then it takes a function, a callback function. So let's create that function here. It has no name, and then inside of here it takes in two parameters, that is the error and the data. So the error represents whatsoever error that is encountered when trying to read the file, and then the data represents whatsoever we get after reading the file successfully. So what we will say here is if error exists, if error is there, let's log to the console. Some of these things I am doing, you already know them. We've seen them in previous videos, so it shouldn't be so difficult. I hope you're able to follow. So we log to the console saying something went wrong, and then show the error that we got. However, yeah, we could also exit this place. We just exit as usual. Just exit, just as we exited the other time. We use one as usual. All right, then assuming that everything goes well, let's log the data to the console. So we just put in data here, and that is it. This is all you really need to read a file, and we're trying to read the db.json file. So what will it tell us when we try to run the file? So let's do node query db. What happens? Hit enter, and it tells us that something went wrong. What exactly went wrong? When we look closely at the error here, it's saying that no such file or directory. That means that this file does not exist. Let's try reading a file that exists and has something in it, and that would be the db file check. Let's just be sure we spell that correctly. db file check. Okay, I think that's correct. You save that, and then you run this again, hit it, and what does it tell us? db file check does not. Okay, we're using a wrong extension. It should be .js, not .json. So save it again. All right, let's clear the terminal, run it again, and hit enter. Now it returns our data because the file exists, but notice that it returns it as a buffer. Let's let's zoom in on this. It returns it as a buffer with codes. Yeah, a very long code. So what do we do about this? Now let's go back to our code and then let's make this to be readable. For us to make it readable, we need to convert this to a string. So we do dot to string. Dot to string. Don't forget about the closing braces. Save it, and then let's try reading that file again. So Ctrl K to clear, read the file again, hit enter, and boom, we have everything that is written in that file. Isn't this awesome? This is everything we have in that file. And so we could choose to manipulate this just as we wish. It's a string at this point. Beautiful. Now, if you recall, we said that we want to do more than just retrieve file and show file in this particular file. So retrieve data and show data in this particular file. We want to be able to take in functions from other files and run them through this particular function. So that means first we need to export this function. Now I made a mistake in the other file when we were creating the DB file check. I said the default keyword is necessary. Where is that? I said default keyword is necessary when you're exporting the file. Now you're not actually exporting the file, I mean exporting the function, not exporting the file. We could have multiple functions in this file, as we will see very soon, but the only one can have the default keyword because it's like the base function or the default function. So just to have that at the back of our mind. So back to this, what we want to do is first export the function, take in a parameter or an argument, and then write a code that would handle all those scenarios. But let's begin by exporting. So we want to convert this to something that will be exported. So let me cut and hold on to that code and then export it to be default. It will be asynchronous. This is very necessary, especially for when you'll be reading files that are from remote locations that are not in your computer. So it will take some time for you to get the data back so that you don't run into timeout or stuff like that. So try to ensure that your function is asynchronous and the file system manipulations are also asynchronous. All right, so async function, you hit enter, it auto creates the function for me, and I'll be naming this function the same name of the file, and that's query db. Awesome. Now it will be taking an argument and want that to be the external function. Awesome. All right, it's getting a little longer, so let's reduce the font. I hope you can see that. Or maybe let me just drag this out and keep the fonts bigger. Yes. All right, just so that you can see everything properly. Now let's paste back this function here, and we'll try calling it from another file where we'll actually retrieve data, and that is the retrieve data.js file. So first of all, this function will no longer work in this file because we are not calling it here in this file. So just to test that out, Control clear, run the file again, and you get no output. For this function to work, we need to call it somewhere. Now we could call it here like this, and that should work. Call this here, hit, and we get our output, right? But since we want this file to do a lot of work, it might start to interfere with other files when we start passing in the functions from other files into this function. So what we want to do is to ensure that we are retrieving the file when we're supposed to retrieve it, and we are using the data when we're supposed to use it, just to separate concerns and also make our project very modular, easy to read. We'll use another file to retrieve the data. So we'll now call this function in another file, and that is the retrieve data file. So just the same way that we imported the fs module, we'll also import the function, that's the query db function, from the query db.js file. So let's do that. Import query db, all right, from this. Make sure it has the extension .js here. All right, and all we need to do is just to call the function query db here and close that bracket. Save it, and then let's call the function here. We've cleared here. All right, let's now, just to be clear, when we call this, it gives us no output. Now let's call the retrieve data function, retrieve data file, sorry. Hit, and we have the output. Awesome, everything is working perfectly. Now we'll come back to test this file again, just to be sure everything is working fine, after we've finished building out the query db file, just to be sure. So what do we want to happen here? Now this external function sometimes might need to be run only after we've been able to retrieve data. For example, when we are working with the remove data file or the update data file, we need to have retrieved the data before working on those files. However, if we're working with the add data file and there is no file, that add data file will create the file, that is the db.json file, right? And so we will not need to have retrieved data before running that file. So in order to make sure that all these scenarios work properly, we'll rewrite all this code that we have here, just to make sure that everything is clear. So let's clear this, all right? And then we'll start with the try and catch block. The try and catch block will help us to catch errors easily, and then all our code that we really want to try out will go into the try block. Cool. So the try block will just log the error to the console. So log to the console and say something went wrong. Yes, and then we'll just add the error, what went wrong. And that is it. All right. All right. Now back into the try block. This is where everything actually lives. The first thing we want to do here is to create a variable where we'll be keeping the data that we'll be getting from inside of the db.json file. All right, so we will use a let info equal to empty braces like this. All right, this is a square bracket. Okay, now the first thing is to check if the file exists. So let's do an if statement. It's going to be an if else. So if else like this, and what's the condition? fs.existSync. We want to check if the db.json file exists. All right. Now, if this file exists, then we can now read the file. So you put await fs.read file. Read file. Remember, it takes in two arguments, and the first one is the file that is being read. Get this off. All right. The file that is being read, that is the db.json file, and then the function, the callback function that has no name. All right. The callback function also takes in two arguments, and that is the error and data. Now, if error, so if for example error occurs, we want to make sure that we terminate the process. So if there is error, right, if there is error, we'll log to the console and say reading file failed. We can add the error by the side for context. All right. Now, if there is no error, we want to process the data. So for us to process the data, we'll need to convert it to string and then convert it to the original format that it was. We are expecting that the db.json data would be in arrays, and it will be arrays of objects of every data that we passed in. So by passing it through the json.parse, it will help us to convert it back to the regular array. Remember, we first of all converted it to string, from buffer to string, before we'll be converting it to what it was before, and it's going to be an array. So let's get it back. First thing we want to do is data dot to string. Remember, to string. Now this converts it to a string, but we want to take it back to what it really was before it was made a string, and it was an array. So we are converting it back to an array using json.parse, and then we'll put this inside of here. Beautiful. So we now have an array if the file was existing. Now that we have this, we can now save what we have here in the info variable, and that is awesome. So what is next at this point? At this point, we want to check if an external function was passed in and there is really no error. So if an external function was passed in and there is no error, then it will continue by running this code. So we want to check if external function and check that there is no error. So the double and is saying that these two conditions must be true for this block to run. Now if these two conditions are true, then we will now run this function. This function would be needing the info variable that we have here. Basically what this is saying is while running this function, you pass in this database data into the function so that the function can use, and after it's done using it, it returns the updated function back to the database. Make sense? Now there will be one case when we want to make sure that we terminate any process after an error or after a block is done. So let's use the okay. Okay, this is not really necessary here. We can just stay like this, yeah, and that's fine. But we could use a return just to be sure. We just use a return. Same thing for here. We could use a return. All right. Then how about in the other case? So let's say we have a function, the add data function especially, it is here and there is no file, but we want to add data. Now at the point of adding data, it is okay not to have a file, because the add data file will create the file. So we want to do if the external function exists. At this point in the else in the else block, it already means that the file doesn't exist. So if that file doesn't exist and the external function exists, we'll just run the external function and return here like that. That is it. So either ways, we are getting what we asked for. We think we need to remove this exit from here. That wasn't necessary. All right, so let's save that just to be sure that the retrieve data file still works. So let's clear this, do the retrieve data, hit it. It returns nothing because we do not have this db.json file. But let's be clear, db file check .js, save it. Okay, we'll also need to copy paste it here. We just want to be sure that we are not breaking anything that we have set up before. So let's save this and run this again, hit it. We have an error somewhere, undefined one. So where is this? json.parse. So undefined one. So where are we having an error? This data.toString. Oh yeah, we can't actually pass what we have here. We can't actually, let's comment that out. We can't pass that. It's not an array yet. What we have there is just a bunch of text. We just have a bunch of text, but let's be sure that we are getting the right thing here. So let's log to the console what we are getting. Log, do data dot to string, save, and let's run this again. Beautiful, everything works fine. So what was happening before was, we are expecting that what we'll be passing into the database would be an array. So because we are expecting that it would be an array, we have decided to pass it, and as at the point of passing it, we are doing a wrong conversion which doesn't exist. But as we continue, you see why this code is correct. So we can just get this away from here, and then we'll log the info to the console. We just want to be seeing what we have in the database at every point. So for every time we call it, we want to have it. All right, so let's clear this. Everything works perfectly from what we have done so far, but I'll give you a run through again for what we are doing here. So what we are doing here is we are retrieving data from the database, which at the moment really doesn't exist, but we have tested using the DB file check, and we see that it's working. When we start working properly on adding data, which is actually the next video, you will see how we will create that file, how we will add to the file, and how we will retrieve it, and you see everything makes more sense. We want to change this back to db.json because that's what we'll be working with. Feel free to create a db.json file and put in a bunch of code and see what comes out of it. You know what? I think we'll just do that right away, just to be sure. db.json file, we are creating that. Hit enter, and we need an array of anything. So an array of name Sam. Yeah, Sam. Let's save that. Now let's try to retrieve this file. So all right, sorry, let's try to retrieve this file. So hit this, and then we have an error. Node retrieve, yeah, supposed to be retrieve data. Retrieve data. So hit enter, and then notice that we have exactly what we have here in this place. So to show you that what we did here works perfectly, assuming we had a db.json file. Makes sense? All right, let me walk you through what we have done here again. The first thing we did was to export the function that we are creating, and that is a query.db function. We also took in an external function which we'll create subsequently, and then and then we began by creating a try catch block. Recall that we said that the try catch blocks help us to catch error at this point. So if everything inside here fails, then we can catch the error here. All right, now inside the try block, we began by creating a variable. This info variable is to hold the data that we will be retrieving in a moment. Then we now check, does this db.json file exist? Now if it doesn't exist, for a file like the add data file, it will still run down here. However, a file like the update data and the remove data won't get to this end because the db file check would have terminated the process. Now if it exists, we retrieve the data, or we try to retrieve the data. Now if there's an error, we return this error and return, and the process stops. If there is no error, then we get our data back and we convert it back to what is supposed to be, and that is an array. Now after that, we now check if the external function exists and there is no error, then we will execute. If not, we come down here and check. Now let's assume that the file isn't there, but we have the external function. What do? We execute, and that is all that is happening in this code. We have gotten this right, and we will move to the add data file in the next tutorial or in the next video. See you in that one.